To get started on this exercise, you should have downloaded the Staging Ball Bounce Animate file. When you double click and open it up in Animate, the first thing we need to do is to go up to our scaling and let's say it to show all. Now this is going to be set up very similar to what's in the book. The only major difference is that I've added a background to further enhance the staging and perspective that we're going to be adding, and I've changed the color of the ball. If you hit return and play the sequence, you can see this looks very familiar. This is the same setup that we did for the arc exercise last week. Now what we're going to be doing is have the ball, instead of bouncing from the left to the right, bounce from the foreground in perspective into the background. And we want to do it in a very realistic way. So the first thing we're going to do is to set up a nice reference grid that our ball can bounce into to keep it nice and realistic. To get started, I'm going to go down to my timeline and return to frame 1. Now I don't need to see my ball at this time, so I'm going to click on the little eyeball icon to turn it off, and I'm going to create a new layer. This layer needs to be on top of the ball layer, and I'm going to double click the name and we're going to call it Perspective. Inside of here we need to create a horizon line that matches the same 1-point perspective in our building. Now if you look very closely at the center of this image, I'm giving you where the vanishing point is for this particular picture. So all of the other walls vanish to this point. We need to create a horizon line that also matches this point as well. So to do that, let's go to our toolbox and select the Line tool. With the Line tool selected, go over to your Properties panel, make sure the tool is selected, and also make sure that Draw mode is turned on, so we want it to be highlighted. You can set your stroke color to be something nice and bright. So I'm going to choose a bright red, and we're going to keep it at a 1-point stroke. To create the horizon line, carefully place your cursor right on top of this middle point and hold down the Option key as you click and drag. Notice that this will create a line from the central point moving outward. We want to carefully just move it until it goes all the way to the edge and has a nice horizontal line. The next thing we need to do is to create a grid of squares that we can put into perspective. Now these squares don't just need to be any arbitrary size, they need to be the same size as our ball. So I'm going to go down to our timeline and turn back on visibility for our ball for now. And I'm going to create a new layer. This layer is going to be on top of everything, and we're going to call this our grid layer. Inside this grid layer, let's select our rectangle tool. And under the properties, I'm going to turn off drawing mode. Now if you're following along in the book, I do want to point out that there is a mistake that'll come up later if you keep object drawing mode turned on. So I'm on page 141 now, and in the book it's telling you to keep object drawing mode turned on. I'm telling you to turn it off for now. Also in the properties panel, set your fill color to be none. And we can set our stroke color. I'm going to keep mine not black but slightly gray so that we can see it on our darker background as well. Again, we'll keep our stroke size set to 1. And with our ball turned on, we need to create a perfect square that's the same size as our ball, because our ball is going to be our reference point. So to do this, I'm going to hold down the Shift key as I click and drag, and creating a perfect square that's the same size as our ball. Now if you mess up, you can always use your free transform tool to select the entire object and then resize it to match the height and width of your ball. Mine was created perfectly, so we're okay for this. Now that we've created a single square, we can turn off visibility for our ball. And let's make a copy of our square. We need 10 squares going across in a row. Before we do this, make sure to go up to View, down to Snapping, and have Snap to Objects checked on. You want to see that check mark next to this object or this option. With our black arrow selection tool, hold down the Option key as you click on the square and drag it off to the right. Because snapping is turned on, you can see how it automatically snaps to that right-hand edge. Now we've also made a copy of it because we held down our Option key. Again, holding down Option, click and drag this one and create another one from there. So there's 3. We want to create 4 and 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and here's a 10th one. Again, I held down the Option key as I click and drag each one of those squares. Now that we've got all 10 of these, let's also make a column, or excuse me, 10 more rows of these in a column format. To do this, I'm going to zoom out just a little bit more. So I'm going to do Command and the minus sign so I can see the entire thing. Maybe I'll scroll down from here. Also, we want to select all of the rectangles that we've created. So return to your timeline and click on the word grid. This will select everything that's in this area. Hold down the Option key as you click and drag down to create 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Let's scroll down a little bit more, and then finally 10. So very quickly you've created a grid of 10 by 10 inch squares, or ball-sized squares. To see everything, you can now go up to your zoom and do show all. This will show the entire grid all together. The next thing we need to do is to center our grid on the stage and align it to the bottom edge. Now if you're following along in the book, it's going to ask you to group all of these different rectangles and squares together. I'm telling you, do not group it. Because we drew this in object drawing mode turned off, you should be able to select individual lines instead of the individual squares. They're already grouped together, so you do not have to group anything. But we do need to select the entire grid. So once again, return to your timeline and click on the word grid to select everything on here. Next, we need to open up our Align panel. So let's go up to Control, and if you don't see it, go to Window and open up Align. Here's our alignment panel on the side. Do make sure Align to Stage is checked on, and then click the second alignment. This will align everything horizontally to your stage. And then choose the last one to align everything to the bottom of your stage. Notice this moved everything over and up and nice and into alignment. Once again, we can return to our zoom level, and let's show all to show both the grid and the stage that we're working on. Now to put this grid into 1-point perspective, so that it looks like it's laying on the ground, we need to return to our perspective layer and draw off 2 guidelines for it. So going down to our timeline, let's choose our perspective layer, and I'm going to zoom in so that I can see both our vanishing point and the bottom left and right edges of our grid. Let's grab our line tool, and with the line tool selected, we'll return to our tool properties. At this time, we can turn back on object drawing mode, and we'll set our stroke color back to that bright red that we used before. From here, you need to draw a line from this bottom left corner up and to the vanishing point that's right here. Let's do the same thing for the right side too. So click on the bottom right corner and drag up into their vanishing point. Now we've got a nice perspective lines that we can place our grid into. Going back down to our timeline, let's select our grid. So by clicking on the name, this will select the entire grid. And then finally, let's go up to our zoom level and show everything so we can see the entire grid. Now with just the grid selected, let's choose our free transform tool and go down to the very bottom and make sure free transform is the option that you're working in. With that, you can hold down the Option key as you click on the top center little square. When you drag down, we're going to drag it all the way down to our horizon line. Let's zoom in so we can see it. Next, with the free transform still selected and you haven't deselected anything, let's go back down to the bottom and let's choose Distort as our option. Now this is where it came in handy to change from what the book did. If you don't have Distort as an option, this means you've been either working in drawing mode or you've grouped all of your lines together. You need to back up and make sure you've done and followed the instructions as I've laid out for this video and not necessarily what the book has done. With Distort selected, you should be able to click on the top left and top right hand corners and drag them inward and distort them in a perspective way. We want to have this grid aligned nice and just before it reaches the back corner. So right about there, about halfway down the perspective grid that you have. Let's do the same for this right-hand side. Clicking and dragging, we want to follow the line, and we want this grid to be nice and parallel with all of the other lines. So notice where I've placed these. It doesn't go all the way to the back corner. It stops just short of there, and this line is nice and parallel with the back edge that's from there. Once it's done, you can click away to deselect it, and this will put your perspective grid nice and in perspective. With this part done, we can now go down to our timeline, and let's turn back on visibility for our ball, and click on the ball layer and drag it up so that's on top of everything, on top of your grid and your perspective layer. Also, while we're down here, I'm going to go ahead and lock down my grid, perspective, and even my background so I don't accidentally make any changes to those layers. Now let's set up a new reference for our bouncing ball. We'll go up to our zoom and let's show just all of it so we can see the entire area. Right now, if we play the sequence, our ball is only bouncing 3 times and it's landing or finishing back in mid-air. If this was to bounce in perspective, we want it to continuously lose momentum and eventually come to rest on the ground. So let's go into our ball sequence and let's set up and repurpose this ball to have a few more bounces and a nice natural finish. To do this, I'm going to choose my black arrow selection tool and double click on the ball to enter into the ball's isolation mode. The first thing we want to do is to create a duplicate of our ball and use that duplicate as a reference for how high it should be bouncing as it moves into perspective. Here's how we're going to do that. Go into our timeline. Let's create a new layer. Now this new layer, we're going to rename it as our ref layer for reference. We're also going to turn this reference layer into a special guide layer. So right-click on it and choose Guide. Notice that it changes the icon into this little T-square, and it won't play whenever we go to practice this, but it will be used as a reference point for future animation. From here, I'm going to select our blue ball that we have. We'll go up to Edit and Copy. Then I'm going to return to my reference layer. Make sure you click on the very first frame. Let's go to Edit and Paste in Place. And this will paste a copy of our ball right on top of the ball that we have. Now we want to start our bouncing sequence at the very top of our frame. So I'm going to go up to here and click and drag this new ball till it reaches the very top of our stage. Now we want the entire time of this to last longer than the 3 bounces. We're going to have it last 101 frames. So go into our timeline, select the 101st frame. Let's press F6 to add another keyframe. Inside of this keyframe, we finally want it to come to rest at the bottom of our stage. So with that 101st frame selected, let's click and drag our ball straight down. By the way, I'm holding down my Shift key until it reaches that bottom edge. Now we can do a motion tween between these two. So selecting that first frame, right-click on this, let's do a classic tween in between those. Also, while we have this first frame selected, we can go over to our tweening. Let's do a classic ease, and we'll do it as a positive 50. So right about there, we'll give it a little bit of easing out. Now when we play, you can see our reference. It's going to take that long for it to finally come to a final stopping point. Now let's go back and use our reference ball as a starting point for our regular ball that we've been working on. So we'll go back to frame number 1, and I'm going to lock down my reference layer just to make sure I don't select that one. We only work on our ball that's going to be seen in our final animation. So with that first frame selected, we can move our ball up into position right here. Now since this ball is starting at a slightly higher position, it's going to take longer for it to fall. So we need to adjust that in our timeline as well. Since this first little span of keyframes is the falling distance, we need to insert a few more frames to give it a little bit more time. So place your cursor and select one of the frames in between here and hit F5 twice, once, twice, to nudge that over just a little bit more. Now if you're following along in the book, this is where the instructions get a little bit tricky, but here's what the author is doing. he's going to ask you to adjust the number of frames between the highest point all the way down to where it squashes. And we want to do so until the ball reaches a natural finish. So we're going to be adjusting the number of frames in between the fall and then the rebound as it comes back up all the way until it reaches 101 frames. Now if you're following along in the book, he gets these numbers based on this graph here. Notice the red line, how it tends to curve. This is the easing out that we added to that ball as it dropped for our reference ball. So every time this red line touches one of the little gray squares, that's the number that he's using, and we're reading it backwards. So if you're following along, the first set of ball as it drops all the way down to squash should have 13 frames between it. Let's test it out. Go into our reference layer, not our reference layer, our regular layer. This is the highest point, and this keyframe represents the squash of our ball. So in between these two different points, there should be 13 frames. To test it out, I'm going to hit the period button on my keyboard to advance it one frame at a time. So if I hit it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So here's our 13th frame, and the very next one should be our squash frame. So that's where he got the number 13. If we go back to the book, you can see in our sequence, once it hits the ground, it's going to lose a little bit of momentum, and so it's going to take 10 frames to rebound up, and then another 10 frames to fall all the way back down. Let's test it out and see what we have for here. So there should be 10 frames between our squash all the way up until our stretch back into a normal position. So let's test it. Hitting the period key, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then the next one should be at the full peak for there. So that one actually looks good. Let's see if there's 10 in between here. So placing our cursor on the 26th frame, hit the period key 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then the next one should be our final squash sequence from here. So we're going to repeat this process for each of the squash and rebound, fall and rebound sequences. And if you're following along in the book, now there should be 8 frames between that one as it goes up and then 8 as it falls back down. Let's see what we have for this one. So place your cursor on frame 37, and let's hit the period key. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Uh-oh, looks like we have an extra frame that's added on to here. So I'm going to remove a keyframe here. So select the 45th keyframe, or 45th frame, and do Shift F5 to remove a frame. Now that we're on that 8th frame, the next one should be our highest point. So select frame 46, and let's see if there's 8 frames between here. So hitting the period key, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Uh-oh, we've got one extra frame. So select frame 54 and do Shift F5 to remove that frame. And then the next frame should be 55 at the squash here. Going back to our sequence, in the book, the next set should have 6 and 6. So let's go to here. We want to have 6 frames in between this one. So with frame 55 selected, hit your period 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You can see we've got several different ones here. So select frame 61 and do Shift F5 to remove a frame 1, 2 times, and then that last keyframe should be on frame 62. Now we need to have 6 more frames before it finally falls back down. So with frame 62 selected, hit your period key 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times, and let's do one more time because on frame 69 is where it should be at its lowest, at its squash. So let's insert a keyframe at frame 69. I'm going to hit F5 to insert a new keyframe, F6 to insert a new keyframe from there. The next set of sequence that we want is going to have 5 in between those two. So hitting our period key, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then one more, you should be on keyframe 75, and let's hit F6 to insert a keyframe there, and we need 5 more frames after this one. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then one more. We should be on frame 81 and hit F6 to insert a keyframe right there. The next set in our book, we need to have 4 and 4. So returning to our timeline, I've got this 81st keyframe selected. Let's hit the period 1, 2, 3, 4 times, then hit it one more time. We should be on frame 86 now, and hit F6 to insert a keyframe. Let's do 4 more. So 1, 2, 3, 4, one more to grow on. Should have frame number 91 selected. Hit F6. The next sequence should be frame number 3, so we'll knock it over, or excuse me, 3 frames over. So let's hit our period 3 times. 1, 2, 3. One more to grow on. That'll give us frame 95, and we'll hit F6 to insert a keyframe at 95. Then we'll hit it a couple of more times, so 2 frames in between this one. So hitting the period key once, twice, one more to grow on. With frame number 98 selected, we'll hit F6. And then finally we want 1 keyframe in between here, so hit the period key once and one more. Select frame number 100 and hit F6 to end it there. And the book will actually have us add one more at the very end to end it on. Now I know that seemed super complex, so if you're following along with me, I'm going to recap everything that we just did. You should have keyframes at frame number 1, then you should have a squash keyframe at frame number 15. Keep in mind you've got 2 little keyframes for the little stretching as it rebounds. Then you should have another keyframe at 26, a keyframe at 37, a keyframe at 46, a keyframe at 55, a keyframe at 62, a keyframe at 69, a keyframe at 75, a keyframe at 81, a keyframe at 86, a keyframe at 91, a keyframe at 95, 98, 100, and finally 101. Now that we've established all these keyframes, let's adjust the height of our ball and make appropriate edits where needed. I'm going to zoom in so I can see both my timeline and the ball we're working on, and let's return to frame number 1. You can see frame number 1 is already set up to have our regular ball and our reference layer matching. Frame number 2, our ball is going to drop down and squash, so we're not going to worry about adjusting this one. Frame number 26 is where it rebounds up, and you can see how it's off by a little bit. So I'm going to select on frame number 26 our ball and drag it down to match our reference. Frame number 37 is a squash, so we'll keep it there. Frame number 46 is a rebound, and you can see how it's off. So I'm going to select our ball and drag it down to match our reference. Frame number 55 is a squash, so I'll keep it there. But frame number 62 is a rebound, so with the 62nd frame selected, click on your ball and have it readjust. Now from here we're starting to get into new territory. Since frame 62 was a rebound, frame number 69 is going to be a squash. So I actually need to get rid of this position, so I'll delete that away. Now when it comes back up on frame number 75, you can see how it's off. So I'm going to drag that down to match our reference. Frame number 81 should be a squash. So with frame 81 selected, hit delete and delete it away. It's going to rebound up to frame number 86. And there we can select that one and drag it down. When it goes back down, frame number 91 should be a squash. So I'm going to delete that one away. But when it comes back up on frame number 95, we'll select our ball and have it be right there And then finally, frame number 98 should be a squash, so I'm going to delete that. And we're not going to worry about squashing or doing anything to frame number 100 or 101, but I will select frame number 100 and we'll place it right there. And then frame number 101, select your ball and bring it back down to match the reference as well. If you were to test your animation by hitting return, you can see that your regular ball is now matching the height of your reference as it falls down. With the height reference done, now let's create a set of references for our squashing ball. And this is actually going to go a little bit easier now that we've set up our pacing for our ball. The first thing we need to do is go down to our timeline and let's create another layer on top of layer number 1, and we're going to call this our squash reference. With that layer selected, let's go back to frame number 1. And I'm also going to turn off visibility for our regular reference layer. So we're just going to be working on our squash reference layer. Let's go to the first keyframe for where it's squashing. In this case, it's frame number 15. And let's make a copy of this squash. So with it selected, let's go up to Edit and Copy. Then we can go into our squash reference layer and select layer 15. And let's insert a keyframe by hitting F6. In this case, it'll be blank until we go up to Edit, and let's do Paste in Place. And this will create a new squash reference right here in the center. Now, as it bounces, it's going to get less and less squashed all the way to the very end. And the very last squash that we want to do will be this one right here. So selecting this 98th frame, let's insert one more keyframe by hitting F6 on here, and let's adjust the squash of this ball. So let's open up our transform panel. If you don't see it on this side, we can always go up to Window, down to Transform, and let's set our ball on this 98th keyframe to have a squash of 100 and a stretch of 100 as well. This will put it back to a normal ball. Now we can close out our transform panel. Let's go back to our original keyframe on frame number 15, and let's right-click on it and create a classic tween. Now when we play, you can see our ball's squash reference is going to get more and more rounded as it goes through. Now what we want to do is use our reference for our squashing and have our regular ball match that amount of squash with it as well. To do this is actually really easy. Let's go to our squash that's on our ball. You can see this happens at frame number 37. And let's select frame 37 for our squash reference. With that frame selected, when I hit F6 and create a new keyframe, this will automatically create a new object in that layer as well. So all I need to do is swap out these two instances. So select keyframe 37 on your layer 1 and delete it away. Then select keyframe on your squash reference layer. We can go up to Edit and Copy, and let's paste it right here inside of our regular ball layer. So select keyframe 37 in your layer 1, and go up to Edit and Paste in Place. Let's do the same for the next instance of squashing. Going down to layer 1, you can see on frame number 55, select frame 55 on your squash reference and hit F6 to insert a new keyframe. With that layer selected, we can go up to Edit and Copy, then go down to your regular ball layer on frame number 55. With it selected, you can hit Delete to delete it away, and then with it still selected, you can go up to Edit and Paste in Place to paste that one in there. The next squash reference is going to happen on frame number 69. So go to frame 69 on your squash reference, hit F6 to create a new keyframe. We're going to copy this frame's reference, so go up to Edit and Copy. Then select frame 69 in your regular ball layer and go up to Edit and Paste in Place to paste that squash into there. Let's go to the next squash. This will happen at frame number 81. So select frame 81 in your squash reference. Go up to Edit. Hit F6 first. Now you can go up to Edit. We're going to copy that frame. Then select frame 81 in your regular ball layer. Go up to Edit, Paste in Place. 2 more times. The next squash is going to happen on frame number 91. So select frame 91 in your squash reference. We'll go up to Edit. Let's hit F6. Create a new keyframe first. Now you can go up to Edit and Copy. Then go to frame 91 in your regular ball layer. Go up to Edit, Paste in Place. And finally, let's do the last one down here. This should just be a regular ball. In this case, you can select keyframe on number 98 on your squash reference. You can copy it and go back down to your reference on your layer 1, go to Edit, and Paste in Place for this one. Now when you turn off visibility for your squash reference, you can see how the ball will bounce and the squashing will also readjust as well. Now at this point in the book, it's going to ask you to also create references for the rebound and the stretching as it falls and jumps back into the air. To be honest, it's a bit of an overkill for what we're doing. So I'm going to completely skip over this part, and we're going to go with the amount of sequences that we have. Once you've got your squash and rebound for the rest of these key sequences, it should be enough. What we do need to do next is add our motion tween and then add our easing in and out for each appropriate part. So for the next thing, click on the last keyframe, which would be keyframe 62 that we established, hold down Shift, and then click on keyframe 101, and we can right-click on it and choose Create Classic Tween. This will add our tweening in for all of these. The last thing we need to do is to add our easing in for each part as well. Remember, in between each one of these movements, we need to ease in and out the appropriate amount. So I'm going to select the, the 65th keyframe. So this keyframe right here, this sequence needs to ease in, since the last one we did eased out. So with frame number 65 selected, let's go to our tweening, and we're going to decrease this by -100. Then select frame number 72. This sequence needs to ease out, so we're going to increase this by +100. Then select keyframe number 78. That sequence needs to do -100 to ease in. Select keyframe 83. And that sequence needs to ease out, so a +100. Keyframe 88, we'll do a -100 for the easing. And then finally keyframe 93 will ease out by doing a +100 for that. And I think we can actually do one more. Let's select frame number 96. Let's do a -100 to ease in for that one. If we test our animation by hitting return, you can see that our ball will bounce and finally come to a final rest. Now before we put this into perspective, the last thing we need to do is return to our squash reference layer, right click on it. Let's make this a guide layer. This way this won't play whenever we test it out. Let's go back up to the very top left and choose scene 1 to return to our main scene, and let's place our ball into perspective. In order to do this, let's go to our 101st keyframe, and with it selected, hold down Shift and select all of the 101st keyframes on every layer and choose F6 to insert a new keyframe. Now we need to move this keyframe over, so I'm actually going to remove it by right-clicking on it and choose Clear Keyframe. This will tell our ball to move from the original starting point, and now we can change our ending point for the rest of the timeline. So selecting the 101st keyframe on the ball layer, let's move our ball up into our main stage, then we can choose our free transform tool, and with it selected, let's have it scale downward. When it scales down, we can also move it back to the back corner. Now when we hit return, you can see our ball is going to bounce into perspective and finally land out for that area. Now when you go to test your movie, if it looks like it's still not bouncing or traveling a little bit too far, for instance, I can see it's moving a little far for that edge, this is where we can use our selection tool and click on our ball, and let's bring it in just a little bit so that it lands and falls in a little bit more naturally. Now when I go to test it, you can see it won't travel just as far before losing its momentum and stopping where it needs to stop. With this done, let's save up our Animate document. Go to File and Save As. Make sure to add your name to the end of this document. Save it as an Adobe Animate document and upload that to Moodle for your exercise grade.